I remember a Monday morning appointment with a man named Sylvester Reeves that changed how I talked to every patient about breakfast. Sylvester was 66 years old, a retired high school principal from Fredericksburg, the kind of man who ran his mornings like a well-oiled machine, up at 5:30, newspaper and breakfast at exactly 6:15, every single day for as long as he could remember. He came to see me not because of anything alarming, just a routine checkup his wife had nagged him into scheduling. When we checked his blood pressure that morning, it came back higher than it had any reason to be for a man who walked every evening, didn't smoke, and rarely touched dessert. He was frustrated. He'd been managing his blood pressure medication faithfully for 3 years, and the numbers simply weren't cooperating the way they should have. So we did what I always do in these situations. We walked through his entire day, meal by meal, hour by hour, and there it was, sitting quietly at the center of his morning routine the whole time. 2 slices of cured breakfast bacon and a bowl of his favorite processed cereal every single morning, without exception, for over a decade. If you're watching this video right now, there's a good chance something very similar is sitting on your own breakfast plate most mornings. And I want you to know up front, this isn't about guilt or shame. It's about a food so completely normalized, so deeply woven into what we consider a proper American breakfast, that almost nobody ever stops to ask what it's actually doing inside the body every single day. Today I want to walk you through exactly what this food does to your blood pressure and why stopping it, or at minimum cutting it back dramatically, may be one of the simplest changes you can make this week. My name is Dr. Anderson Coco. I've spent nearly 20 years focused almost entirely on the health of people over 60, first inside a large hospital system here in Virginia, and for the past decade through my own private practice, built around one central goal: helping older adults protect their heart, their mobility, and their independence for as long as possible. I got into this work because I watched my own grandfather struggle with blood pressure for the better part of 2 decades, cycling through medications that never quite worked as well as they should have, without anyone ever sitting him down and asking the simple question I ask every patient today: what does your breakfast actually look like? Let's start with what this food actually is, because I think understanding its history helps explain why it's become such a fixture on so many tables. Cured breakfast meats, bacon, sausage links, and similar processed pork products became a staple of the American breakfast table in the early 20th century, largely thanks to clever marketing campaigns in the 1920s that convinced the public a hearty, meat-based breakfast was the foundation of good health and a productive day. That messaging worked remarkably well, and nearly a century later, bacon and sausage remain, for millions of people, simply what breakfast is supposed to look like. Nobody questions it, because it's been handed down, plate after plate, generation after generation, as an unquestioned tradition rather than an active daily choice. Here's what almost never gets explained clearly. The defining feature of cured breakfast meats isn't really the fat content, though that matters too. It's the sodium, specifically in the form of curing salts and preservatives added during processing. A modest serving of bacon or breakfast sausage can easily contain a significant portion of your entire recommended daily sodium intake, and that's before you've added a single shake of the salt shaker to your eggs or toast. Sodium's relationship to blood pressure is one of the most well-established findings in all of cardiovascular medicine. When you consume excess sodium, your body retains additional water to keep your blood sodium concentration balanced. That extra retained fluid increases the total volume of blood circulating through your vessels, and more volume moving through the same amount of space means more pressure against your artery walls, every single beat, all day long. This isn't a theoretical concern. It's basic, well-documented physiology that plays out in the body every time processed, cured meat becomes a daily habit rather than an occasional treat. Now let's connect this to blood sugar, because the relationship here genuinely surprises most of my patients. Processed breakfast meats are frequently paired, as they were in Sylvester's case, with refined, processed cereals or white bread, foods that spike blood sugar rapidly and then cause an equally rapid crash an hour or 2 later. That blood sugar roller coaster triggers a cortisol response similar to what we see with other morning stressors, and elevated cortisol, combined with the sodium load from the cured meat, creates a compounding effect on blood vessel constriction. For someone with borderline insulin resistance, which describes a substantial share of adults over 60, this particular breakfast combination essentially asks the cardiovascular system to manage two separate stressors, sodium retention and a glucose spike, within the very same meal every single morning for years on end. Blood pressure, as I mentioned, sits at the center of this entire conversation, so let me go a bit deeper here, because the numbers genuinely matter. Research tracking sodium intake in older adults has consistently found that individuals consuming diets high in processed cured meats show measurably higher average blood pressure readings than those who limit these foods, independent of overall body weight or general activity level. This is precisely what made Sylvester's case so revealing. He wasn't overweight, he exercised regularly. On paper, he looked like a model patient. But his daily sodium load from breakfast alone was quietly working against every other healthy choice he was making throughout the rest of his day, undermining his medication and his evening walks in a way that never showed up anywhere except in his blood pressure cuff. I also want to mention one more overlooked wrinkle here, specific to portion creep over the years. Many of my patients tell me their breakfast portions today look remarkably similar to what they ate decades ago, yet packaged food serving sizes and preparation styles have shifted considerably over that same period, often growing larger or richer without anyone noticing the gradual change. A breakfast that felt entirely reasonable 20 years ago may quietly carry a meaningfully higher sodium load today, simply because the product itself changed shape and size around the same familiar habit. Your heart, of course, bears the brunt of this over time. When blood pressure remains elevated day after day, your heart has to work harder with every single contraction, pushing blood against greater resistance in the arteries. Over months and years, this added strain contributes to thickening of the heart muscle, reduced efficiency, and significantly elevated risk of heart attack and stroke. Cardiology research over the past several decades has repeatedly identified processed meat consumption as an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, separate from its impact on blood pressure alone, likely due to additional compounds formed during the curing and smoking process. Your morning breakfast, in other words, isn't just a blood pressure conversation. It's a whole heart conversation playing out quietly over decades. I want to add one more layer to this before moving on, because it's a question patients ask me constantly once they understand the sodium connection. Many assume that if a food doesn't taste salty, it must be safe from this concern entirely, and that assumption is exactly what makes cured breakfast meat so deceptive in the first place. The smoking and curing process is specifically designed to balance salt against sugar, fat, and smoke flavor, producing a taste profile that reads to your palate as savory and rich rather than sharply salty, even though the sodium content sits right there, largely undetected by taste alone. This is precisely why relying on your tongue to judge a food's sodium content lets so many people down. Your palate simply isn't a reliable instrument for this particular measurement, which is exactly why the nutrition label matters more than instinct here. There's a joint and inflammation angle here too, one that surprises people who've never connected diet to how their knees or hands feel in the morning. Cured, processed meats are among the most reliably inflammatory foods in the standard Western diet, due largely to their high sodium content combined with compounds called advanced glycation end products, which form during the curing and cooking process. Chronic low-grade inflammation from a daily processed breakfast can contribute to increased joint stiffness and discomfort over time, layering on top of whatever natural, age-related joint changes are already happening. Some of my patients are genuinely surprised to find that simply removing cured breakfast meat from their daily routine, replacing it with anti-inflammatory alternatives, reduces their joint stiffness noticeably within just a few weeks, alongside the blood pressure improvements. I want to spend a moment on sleep as well, because it connects to this conversation in a way most people never expect. High sodium intake, particularly in the evening or first thing in the morning, has been shown in research to disrupt normal sleep architecture, partly because your kidneys work harder overnight to process excess sodium, and partly because retained fluid can contribute to mild overnight blood pressure elevation that interferes with deep, restorative sleep. Many of my patients who reduced their sodium intake report improved sleep quality within just a few weeks, something they never expected when they started the process purely to address their blood pressure numbers. It's a reminder that these systems in the body rarely operate in isolation. A change made for one reason often produces benefits that ripple outward into areas you weren't even targeting. Let's also talk briefly about the history of how we came to understand sodium's role in blood pressure at all, because it wasn't always common medical knowledge the way it is today. Large-scale population studies conducted from the 1960s through the 1980s, comparing communities with very different average sodium intakes, first established the clear relationship between dietary sodium and blood pressure levels across entire populations. Since then, decades of additional research, including detailed clinical trials specifically studying dietary interventions, have consistently reinforced and refined that original finding. What's changed more recently isn't the underlying science, which has remained remarkably consistent, but rather our understanding of just how much sodium hides in foods that don't taste particularly salty at all, cured breakfast meats being a prime example, since the curing process itself masks a significant portion of the sodium behind smoke flavor and fat content rather than an overtly salty taste. It's worth putting this in a broader context as well, because comparing dietary patterns across different countries has taught researchers a great deal about how much of this is genuinely cultural habit rather than nutritional necessity. Populations in regions where breakfast traditionally centers around fresh fruit, whole grains, and minimally processed proteins tend to show meaningfully lower average blood pressure readings across their older adult populations, even accounting for other lifestyle differences. This isn't to suggest that a traditional American cured meat breakfast is uniquely dangerous compared to every other cultural breakfast tradition worldwide, but it does suggest that what we consider a normal, unquestioned breakfast is far more a product of habit and marketing history than any kind of nutritional requirement. Your body doesn't actually need cured meat at breakfast to function well. That expectation is learned, which also means it can be unlearned gradually and without much hardship, once you understand what's driving the habit in the first place. I want to tell you about another patient because Sylvester's story isn't unique in my practice, not even close. There was a woman named Ottilie Frame, 63 years old, a retired seamstress from Staunton, meticulous and detail-oriented in everything she did, including her diet, or so she believed. Ottilie came to see me because her blood pressure medication, which had worked beautifully for years, had suddenly stopped controlling her numbers the way it once had. She was baffled and honestly a little offended by the suggestion that her diet might be the culprit, since she considered herself a careful eater. When we walked through her mornings together, it turned out she'd recently started making her own breakfast sausage patties at home, using a recipe passed down from her mother, one that called for a generous amount of curing salt to achieve that familiar traditional flavor. She'd been eating it fresh from her own kitchen every morning for about 8 months, genuinely believing that homemade meant healthier. Homemade cured sausage, unfortunately, carries essentially the same sodium load as the store-bought version, sometimes more, depending on the recipe. Once we adjusted her breakfast and reduced her sodium intake meaningfully, her blood pressure responded to her medication again within a matter of weeks, almost exactly as it had years earlier. I want to share one more story because I think it rounds out the picture in an important way. There was a man named Cornelius Whitby, 70 years old, a retired volunteer firefighter from Bristol, the kind of man who prided himself on discipline and routine, having spent decades adhering to strict schedules on the job. Cornelius came to see me not for blood pressure at all, but because he'd started experiencing mild swelling in his fingers most mornings, enough that his wedding ring had become uncomfortably tight after nearly 40 years of marriage. He assumed it was simply arthritis setting in. When we reviewed his morning routine, his breakfast consisted of 2 breakfast sausage links alongside canned biscuits with gravy, a meal he described, with genuine affection, as his one true comfort each day. The sodium content of that single meal, when we calculated it together, exceeded his entire recommended daily intake before he'd even had lunch. The morning finger swelling wasn't arthritis at all. It was fluid retention, a direct and fairly classic response to his sodium intake. Within about 3 weeks of adjusting his breakfast, the swelling resolved almost completely, and his blood pressure, which had been trending upward at his last 2 appointments, improved meaningfully as well. What strikes me about all 3 of these patients, Sylvester, Ottilie, and Cornelius, is how differently their bodies signaled the same underlying problem. One saw it in his blood pressure readings directly. One saw it in medication that stopped working the way it should have. One saw it in swollen fingers he'd assumed was simply arthritis. The food was the same. The warning signs looked completely different on the surface, which is exactly why this particular habit slips past so many people, and often past their doctors too, in a routine appointment that doesn't have time to walk through a full week of meals in detail. This brings me to the single biggest mistake I see repeatedly around this particular food, and it's this. People assume that because a food is traditional, familiar, or homemade, it must be inherently healthier than something processed and store-bought. That assumption feels reasonable on the surface, but it simply isn't accurate when it comes to sodium content specifically. The curing process itself, whether performed in a factory or in someone's own kitchen using a family recipe, requires substantial salt to achieve that distinctive flavor and texture. The mistake isn't enjoying this food occasionally on a weekend as part of a special meal. The mistake is allowing it to become an automatic, daily fixture on the breakfast plate, consumed without ever questioning its cumulative effect over months and years. I think this mistake persists so stubbornly because breakfast, more than any other meal of the day, tends to run on pure autopilot. Lunch and dinner usually involve at least a small amount of active decision-making, what's available, what sounds appealing, sometimes a conscious choice between a few different options. Breakfast, for most of my patients over 60, is the one meal that hasn't changed in any meaningful way in years, sometimes decades, precisely because it works so well as a fast, reliable start to the day that nobody ever feels a reason to question it. That reliability is exactly what makes it worth examining closely, since a habit repeated without conscious thought for years is a habit whose cumulative effects are also easy to overlook entirely. Before I get to the practical steps, I want to widen the lens a little, because cured breakfast meat rarely sits alone on the plate, and the foods surrounding it often quietly add to the same sodium burden without anyone noticing. Standard sliced bread, even the plain, unremarkable kind most of us have eaten our entire lives, contains a meaningful amount of sodium from the baking process itself, something almost nobody thinks to question, since bread doesn't taste distinctly salty. Processed cheese slices, a common breakfast sandwich addition, add another significant layer. Canned biscuits and pre-made breakfast gravies, like the ones Cornelius enjoyed, are frequently among the highest sodium items on an entire breakfast table, often exceeding the cured meat itself in total sodium content per serving. None of these foods individually seems like the obvious culprit, which is exactly the problem. A full breakfast plate built from several of these ordinary, familiar items can quietly stack into a sodium total that dwarfs what any one ingredient appears to contribute on its own. I also want to address medication interactions directly, because this matters enormously for many of the people watching this video. If you take blood pressure medication, particularly a class of drugs called diuretics, which work partly by helping your body eliminate excess sodium and fluid, a consistently high sodium breakfast essentially asks your medication to work overtime every single day, counteracting a dietary habit that's actively working against its intended effect. Some of my patients have been able to reduce their medication dosage under their doctor's careful supervision after making sustained changes to their sodium intake, simply because their body no longer needed as much pharmaceutical help managing fluid balance once the dietary burden decreased. I want to be careful here because I am never suggesting anyone adjust their own medication independently. That decision belongs entirely with your prescribing physician. But it's worth knowing that dietary changes and medication effectiveness are far more connected than most people realize, and bringing this topic to your doctor could open up a more complete conversation about your overall treatment plan. Let's talk a bit more about potassium as well, since I mentioned it briefly earlier, and I think it deserves fuller explanation. Potassium works almost like a counterbalance to sodium in the body, helping your kidneys eliminate excess sodium more efficiently while also helping relax the walls of your blood vessels directly. Foods naturally rich in potassium include bananas, sweet potatoes, spinach, avocados, and beans, and research has consistently shown that increasing potassium intake alongside reducing sodium produces meaningfully better blood pressure outcomes than reducing sodium alone. This is part of why I encourage my patients to think about breakfast changes in terms of addition, not just subtraction. Adding a handful of spinach to your morning eggs or half an avocado alongside your toast does real, measurable work alongside cutting back on the cured meat itself, and it tends to feel far more satisfying than a change built purely around restriction. There's one more patient I want to mention briefly because her situation adds an important layer to everything we've discussed so far. A woman named Adelaide Turner, 68 years old, a retired church organist from Winchester, came to see me specifically because she'd noticed increasing shortness of breath while climbing the stairs to her choir loft, something that had never bothered her before. She wasn't overweight, she didn't smoke, and her cholesterol numbers were genuinely excellent. Her breakfast, it turned out, was smoked breakfast ham alongside a store-bought breakfast sandwich she picked up most mornings on her way to choir practice, a habit she'd maintained for roughly 2 years since her husband passed, and cooking for one had started to feel like more effort than it was worth. The convenience of that grab-and-go sandwich came with a sodium cost she'd never considered, and combined with her home breakfast on the days she did cook, her average daily sodium intake was running consistently high enough to contribute meaningfully to fluid retention around her heart and lungs, which was the actual source of her shortness of breath. Adelaide's case is a gentle reminder that life circumstances, grief, convenience, simply cooking for one after decades of cooking for two often shape our eating habits in ways that have nothing to do with knowledge or health consciousness and everything to do with the practical realities of daily life. Once we worked together to find lower sodium convenient options that still fit her morning schedule, her breathing improved noticeably within about a month. So what should you actually do instead? Let me walk you through this practically, because simply telling you to stop eating something you've enjoyed for decades isn't especially useful without a clear plan. The first change is to genuinely reduce frequency rather than aiming for total elimination right away, which tends to feel far more sustainable. If cured breakfast meat has been a daily habit, aim to cut it back to once or twice a week initially, giving your palate and your routine time to adjust gradually. The second change is to look closely at what you're pairing it with. A smaller portion of cured meat, balanced with vegetables, fruit, or a source of potassium like a banana or spinach, does less damage than the same meat paired with additional processed, salty sides. Potassium specifically helps your body balance out excess sodium and supports healthy blood pressure regulation, so pairing foods thoughtfully genuinely matters. The third change is to explore lower sodium alternatives. Many grocery stores now carry reduced sodium bacon and sausage options, and while they're not entirely free of the concern, they represent a meaningfully smaller sodium load than traditional versions. The fourth change, and the one I'd encourage you to prioritize above all the others, is to bring this exact conversation to your own doctor, particularly if you're currently managing blood pressure medication that doesn't seem to be working as well as it once did. Ask directly whether your sodium intake has ever been discussed as part of your treatment plan, because in my experience, it often hasn't been, simply due to time constraints during a typical office visit. I want to add a fifth practical change here as well, one that I think deserves its own explanation because it trips up even careful, health-conscious patients, and a sixth change right alongside it that I've found genuinely helps people follow through. Learning to actually read a nutrition label for sodium content is a skill almost nobody is taught directly, yet it makes an enormous difference once you understand what you're looking at. Sodium content is typically listed per serving, but many packages of bacon or breakfast sausage define a serving as far smaller than what most people actually eat in one sitting, sometimes as little as 2 slices, when a typical breakfast portion runs closer to 4. This means the number printed boldly on the front of the package, or the first number your eye lands on, can understate your actual intake by half or more. I encourage my patients to check the serving size definition first, then do the simple math for what they actually plan to eat, before looking at the sodium figure itself. it takes an extra 15 seconds in the grocery aisle, and it genuinely changes how people shop once they start doing it consistently. The sixth change is simply this: batch preparing a lower sodium breakfast option once a week, on a Sunday afternoon, for instance, so that on busy weekday mornings, the healthier choice is just as fast and convenient as reaching for the cured meat out of habit, removing convenience as an excuse for the old pattern to creep back in. Eating out complicates this picture even further, and it's worth addressing directly since so many of my patients over 60 enjoy a weekly breakfast out with friends or family as a cherished social ritual, one I would never want to discourage. Restaurant breakfast meats are frequently even higher in sodium than their grocery store counterparts, partly due to bulk preparation methods and partly because restaurants often prioritize bold, consistent flavor over sodium moderation. A single restaurant breakfast plate featuring bacon or sausage alongside hash browns and toast can sometimes contain close to 2 full days' worth of recommended sodium in one sitting. I'm not suggesting you give up that weekly breakfast tradition with people you love, since the social and emotional value of those gatherings matters too, genuinely, for your overall well-being. What I'd suggest instead is treating that particular meal as your planned exception for the week, while keeping your daily home breakfast consistently lower in sodium, so the overall weekly average stays in a healthier range. I also want to acknowledge something that doesn't get said often enough in conversations like this one, which is the emotional and cultural weight that breakfast foods like these often carry. For many of my patients, a particular breakfast isn't simply about taste or convenience. It's connected to childhood memories, to a parent or grandparent who made it a certain way, to Sunday mornings that felt safe and unhurried in a world that otherwise moved quickly. I don't take that lightly, and I don't think you should have to give up those feelings entirely in the name of better blood pressure numbers. This is precisely why I emphasize reduction and thoughtful substitution rather than complete elimination for most of my patients. You can preserve the ritual, the togetherness, even the flavor in a modified form, while meaningfully reducing the daily sodium burden that's actually driving the health concern. I also want to spend a moment on flavor, because I think this is where a lot of well-intentioned dietary changes quietly fail. People reduce sodium, find the resulting food bland and unsatisfying, and abandon the change within a few weeks, not because they lack discipline, but because nobody offered them a genuinely satisfying alternative. Herbs and spices, black pepper, smoked paprika, garlic powder, fresh rosemary can rebuild a surprising amount of the depth and richness that salt typically provides, particularly when used generously rather than sparingly. A squeeze of fresh lemon or a splash of vinegar can brighten a dish in a way that tricks the palate into perceiving more intensity overall, often reducing the felt absence of salt considerably. I encourage my patients to think of this transition period as roughly 3 to 4 weeks. Taste preferences are genuinely adaptable, and most people who commit to a lower sodium breakfast for about a month report that their old, heavily cured breakfast foods start to taste almost uncomfortably salty to them once their palate recalibrates, a shift that surprises nearly everyone who experiences it firsthand. I also want to touch briefly on energy levels, since this is something several of my patients mention only after we've already been discussing their blood pressure for a while, almost as an afterthought that turns out to be quite relevant. A high sodium breakfast, through the fluid retention and mild blood pressure elevation it produces, can contribute to that heavy, sluggish feeling some people notice an hour or two after eating, distinct from ordinary post-meal tiredness. Patients who reduce their sodium intake at breakfast frequently report feeling noticeably lighter and more alert through the mid-morning hours, an effect they hadn't necessarily connected to their diet beforehand, simply because sluggishness after breakfast had become so routine that it no longer registered as unusual or worth mentioning to their doctor. There's one more piece of physiology worth understanding before we move toward wrapping up, and it's specific to why this matters more as we age rather than less. Something called sodium sensitivity, meaning how strongly your blood pressure responds to a given amount of dietary sodium, tends to increase with age. Your kidneys naturally become somewhat less efficient at excreting excess sodium as the decades pass, part of the normal aging process rather than any specific disease. This means the exact same breakfast that might have had a fairly modest effect on your blood pressure in your 40s can produce a considerably larger effect in your 60s and 70s, even though nothing about the food itself has changed. This is part of why I tell my patients that dietary habits worth questioning at any age become genuinely worth addressing directly once you're past 60. Because your body's margin for tolerating these daily sodium loads has narrowed, often without any obvious warning that the shift has occurred. I want to be very clear about something here, because it matters to me deeply, and I never want anything I share on this channel to be misunderstood as absolute or one-size-fits-all. I am not telling you that you can never enjoy this food again, and I'm not suggesting that everyone watching this video has a blood pressure problem caused entirely by their breakfast plate. Health is rarely explained by a single food or a single habit in isolation. Blood pressure is influenced by many factors: genetics, overall diet, activity level, stress, and sleep among them. And only your own physician, working with your actual blood work and blood pressure history, can tell you what's truly driving your numbers. What I want you to walk away with today is simply a clearer understanding of one commonly overlooked contributor so that you can have a more informed conversation at your next appointment, and so that you can make a more deliberate choice about what lands on your breakfast plate each morning, rather than an automatic one shaped by decades of habit you never consciously chose in the first place. Before we close, I want to say a word about tracking your own blood pressure at home, because it's one of the most powerful tools available to you for understanding exactly how your own body responds to changes like the ones we've discussed today. A simple, inexpensive home blood pressure monitor, checked at roughly the same time each morning, gives you information far more useful than a single reading taken once a year at your doctor's office. If you make changes to your breakfast based on anything in this video, tracking your numbers over 2 to 3 weeks will show you, in concrete terms specific to your own body, whether the change is genuinely making a difference. I've found that patients who track their own numbers stay motivated far longer than those relying purely on how they feel day to day, since blood pressure changes are frequently invisible from the inside until they've progressed considerably. One final practical thought before we move toward the challenge for this week. If change feels overwhelming when you think about it all at once, remember that you don't need to overhaul your entire breakfast tradition overnight. Even reducing cured meat from a daily habit to 3 or 4 times a week while adding a potassium-rich food alongside it produces a measurable shift over several months. Progress in this particular area tends to compound quietly, the same way the original habit did, just in the opposite, healthier direction. I also want to mention that if you live with a spouse or partner who shares your breakfast table, this is genuinely a conversation worth having together rather than pursuing alone, since matching habits within a household make the whole process considerably easier for everyone involved. I've seen this play out repeatedly in my practice, where one partner tries to reduce sodium while the other continues cooking the same traditional meals for both of them. And the well-intentioned effort quietly stalls simply because it's difficult to sustain a different diet than the person sitting across the table from you every morning. Shopping together, trying new lower sodium recipes as a shared project rather than an individual restriction, tends to produce far better results, and it can even become its own small source of connection and shared purpose, something I've heard from more than a few of my patients over the years. If this video gave you something worth thinking about, I'd love for you to hit subscribe, because I cover topics exactly like this every single week. Practical, research-grounded information for people over 60, explained the way I wish someone had explained it to my own grandfather decades before his own blood pressure became such a persistent struggle. And I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Be honest, is cured breakfast meat a daily fixture on your own plate? You're far from alone if it is, and there's no judgment here whatsoever. This channel exists so we can work through these everyday habits together, calmly and without fear, making small adjustments that add up to real protection over the years ahead. Here's your challenge for this week, and I'd genuinely like you to try it rather than simply consider it in passing. For the next 7 mornings, swap your usual cured breakfast meat for a lower sodium or plant-based protein source at least 4 or 5 of those days. Eggs prepared without added cured meat, a small serving of plain Greek yogurt with berries, or oatmeal topped with nuts, and a sliced banana for the potassium benefit we discussed earlier. Season generously with herbs and spices rather than reaching for the salt shaker out of habit. Pay attention to how you feel by mid-morning, and if you check your own blood pressure at home, keep a simple log across the week and see what you notice by the 7th day compared to where you started. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close today. This particular change, unlike some of the more complicated health advice out there, is genuinely one of the simplest and most immediately actionable things I discuss on this channel. You don't need a gym membership, a complicated supplement regimen, or a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. You simply need to look a little more closely at what's already sitting on your plate each morning and make a handful of small, sustainable substitutions. Small changes, repeated consistently over months and years, are almost always more powerful than dramatic changes that fade after a few weeks. And this is exactly the kind of change built to last. Next week, I want to talk about a specific vitamin deficiency that doctors miss constantly in people over 60, one that mimics the symptoms of simple aging so closely that it rarely gets caught until it's already causing real, noticeable problems in daily life. You won't want to miss that conversation. Until then, take care of yourself the way you'd take care of someone you love, because that's exactly what you deserve, one breakfast at a time. I'll see you in the next video.